Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I would like to speak this afternoon about a controversial proposal, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, otherwise known as CISA, which was filed yesterday as an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill. And I want to begin by saying to the Senate that I believe tackling this legislation on the defense bill would, in my view, be a significant mistake. I expect our colleagues are going to have a wide range of views about this legislation, and I hope that the Senate can agree that bills as controversial as this one ought to be subject to public debate and an open-ended process, not stapled on to unrelated legislation with only a modest amount of discussion. This is particularly true given the issue of cybersecurity, which is going to have a significant impact on the security and the well-being of the American people, and obviously the consumer rights and the privacy of law-abiding Americans. And because it is designed to increase government collection of information from private companies, I'm of the view that for the Senate to have this expansion of collecting so much information about the people of the United States, for it to have real legitimacy in the eyes of the public, it's important to have an open debate with votes on amendments from senators who have a wide variety of opinions on the issue of cybersecurity. Trying to rush this bill through the Senate, in my view, is not going to increase public confidence. So let me be clear about the process, Mr. President, and talk a bit about the substance of the legislation as well. I believe tacking it onto the defense bill is a flawed process, but I think there are also significant flaws with the substance of the legislation as well. Dozens of independent experts agree that this legislation will have serious consequences and do little to make our nation more secure at a time when cyber threats are very real. The issue of cyber threats requires more than a placebo, and this legislation is a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. I believe the Senate, having the time for adequate reflection and amendment, can do better. Mr. President, in beginning, I'd like the Senate to know just how much controversy and concern this legislation has generated among those who are considered independent experts on cybersecurity. Shortly before the Intelligence Committee, which I've been honored to serve on for more than 14 years, shortly before the committee marked up this legislation, a coalition of nearly 50 organizations and security experts wrote to the members of the Intelligence Committee expressing serious concerns about the legislation. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that this letter be entered into the record at this time.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the signers of the letter expressed very serious concerns about the legislation and were particularly concerned, and I quote here, that it would, in their words, significantly undermine privacy and civil liberties. Unfortunately, as the signers of the legislation will report, these concerns were not adequately addressed in the committee markup. Shortly after the committee markup, Mr. President, a group of 65 technologists and cybersecurity professionals wrote to Chairman Burr and Vice Chairman Feinstein expressing their opposition to this legislation. I would ask unanimous consent that this letter be entered into the record as well. And Mr. President, this is a particularly important letter, and you have some of the most distinguished independent experts from across the country, whether they're Amazon or Cisco, Stanford University, Dartmouth, some of the leading experts in the private sector and academia expressing real concerns about this legislation and its House companion. From their letter,
objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. From their letter, and I quote, "We appreciate your interest in making our networks more secure, but the legislation proposed does not materially further that goal. And at the same time, it puts our users' privacy at risk. These bills weaken privacy law without promoting security. We urge you to reject them." Mr. President, the reason I want our colleagues to be aware of how these distinguished scientists from Silicon Valley and literally every corner of the country are so concerned is that the American people want both security and liberty. And they understand the two are not mutually exclusive. And what this distinguished group of experts has just said, and I quote, is this weakens privacy without promoting security. And I hope that the Senate will review what these experts are saying. And along the same lines, I would note that the Christian Science Monitor recently polled a group of more than 78 high-profile security and privacy experts from across government, think tanks, and the private sector, with these experts being asked if legislation along the lines of this bill, Mr. President, which has been attached to the defense authorization, these experts were asked if this legislation would significantly reduce security breaches. 87% said that it would not. Many of them noted, a concern I've noted in opposing the legislation, that incentivizing private companies to share information about security threats is a very worthwhile proposition, a worthwhile thing to do, but they go on to say that bills like this are going to have limited value in that area and would have significant negative consequences. Now, many of my colleagues may have some disagreement with some of the dozens and dozens of independent experts that I've just mentioned. Some of them may agree with the 13% of those experts who said that this bill will do a lot to reduce security breaches. That's their right, and that's what a good Senate debate would be all about. But what the Senate should not do, Mr. President, is pretend that this legislation is uncontroversial and try to rush it through without substantial revisions and the chance for senators on both sides of the aisle to be heard. Now, Mr. President, I think we all understand why some here in the Senate would feel that we've just got to move immediately on this issue and, in effect, be tempted to rush to action here. We've all understood that there have been a number of recent high-profile hacks that have drawn attention to the need to improve our nation's cybersecurity. And I don't disagree with the importance of that at all. For example, a major company in Oregon was hacked by the Chinese simply because they were trying to enforce their rights under trade law. So this is not some abstract issue, Mr. President, for the people I represent. We have seen it in my home state. So these hacks, high-profile, hacks like the one we saw, here recently, is obviously drawing attention to the need to improve cybersecurity. The recent compromise of a very large amount of Office of Personnel Management data is obviously the latest of these, but it's certainly not going to be the last. Every single time I read about these kind of hacks, what I do, Mr. President, and have a very talented staff from the Intelligence Committee, my own office to assist me, I try to reach out and talk to experts in the field about ways to improve cybersecurity. But that doesn't mean that every single piece of legislation with the word cybersecurity in it is automatically a good idea that ought to be blessed without revision here in the United States Senate. The fact is, this particular cybersecurity bill is largely focused on trying to make it more difficult for individuals to be able to take on corporations. I understand why the Chamber of Commerce likes it so much. They've always been concerned about the rights of the large, corporations, and sometimes the inevitable is, well, we're concerned about the large corporations, let's make it harder for individuals to be able to get a fair shake in the marketplace. But in my judgment, the actual cybersecurity value of this bill would be very limited, and the consequences for those individuals who are trying to get a fair shake would be quite serious. I'm going to turn in a moment to the substance of the CISA bill to explain why I consider it so problematic and why it's in need of major revisions. But first, I'm going to take just a few minutes to discuss proposals that I believe would actually make a difference in terms of improving American cybersecurity. First, the most effective way to improve cybersecurity is to ensure that network owners take responsibility for the security of their networks and effectively implement good security practices. This proposal was the centerpiece of a 2012 bill. It was called the Lieberman-Collins Cybersecurity Bill. And in my view, Mr. President, that legislation was just a few changes away from being good cybersecurity law. Unfortunately, the notion of having the government create even voluntary standards for private companies was strongly opposed by the Chamber of Commerce, and the Congress has not revisited it since. Beyond ensuring that network owners take responsibility and implement good security practices, it's also important to ensure that government agencies do not deliberately weaken security standards. And when you say that, Mr. President, because I know the President of the Senate has a great interest, as I do, in innovation and American competitiveness, it's pretty hard when you say the words, the American government is actually thinking, as the FBI director has talked about requiring companies to build weaknesses into their products. It's pretty hard to kind of get your arms around this theory, not the least of which is the reason that once the good guys have the keys, the bad guys will also have the keys, which will facilitate cyber hacking. So I have been skeptical of these statements from senior FBI officials suggesting that U.S. hardware and software companies should be required, as I would characterize it, to weaken the security of their products. In my view, because encryption and other advanced security measures are a key component of actually improving cybersecurity. So I was pleased to see that in the other body, just last week, a new amendment from Representatives Massey and Lofgren to prevent the government from deliberately weakening encryption standards was voted on, and I'm very hopeful that the Senate will eventually follow suit. And in fact, I offered that concept, Mr. President, in the Intelligence Committee, and regrettably it did not pass. Now, with regard to government-held data, it's absolutely imperative that federal agencies receive the funding and expertise they need to develop and implement strong network security programs and to ensure that they have the technical and administrative controls in place to combat a wide range of cybersecurity threats. And I also believe our government needs to be in a stronger position to recruit and retain a capable federal cybersecurity workforce by ensuring that cybersecurity professionals can find opportunities in government that are as rewarding as those in the private sector. And in order to ensure that there are enough professionals to fill positions in both the private sector and the government, it's obvious that there's going to need to be an investment in the education of the next generation of cybersecurity leaders. I'd also like to note, as we talk about responsible approaches to deal with these cyber issues, I consider the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, a piece of legislation initiated by Senator Leahy, to be another step in the right direction. This legislation creates a comprehensive approach to data security by requiring companies to build a cybersecurity program that can defend against cyber attacks and prevent data breaches. It also protects a wide range of personal information, not just name or financial account information, but also online usernames and passwords, information about a person's geolocation and access to private digital photographs and videos. Unlike CISA, Mr. President, this legislation would, in my view, provide real tools to address the kind of recent cyber attacks we've seen in the news, like the celebrity photo hack. Unlike CISA, it would also empower individuals by requiring companies to notify consumers if their information has been lost and protect the rights offered under some state laws for consumers to sue in the event of a privacy incident. The Consumer Privacy Protection Act, in my view, is the kind of responsible, thoughtful approach to cybersecurity, which is, again, legislation that will help us get an added measure of security and public protection while at the same time protecting the individual liberties of our people and their privacy. Finally, in my judgment, our country needs to be willing to impose consequences on foreign entities that attempt to hack in to American networks and steal large quantities of valuable data. These hacks are undermining our national security, our economic competitiveness, and the personal privacy of huge numbers of Americans. These consequences should draw on the full range of American power, depending on the nature of the hack and the entity responsible. It would be a failure of American imagination to say that the only way to respond to foreign hacking is to have our military and intelligence agencies hack back, as the concept has been known, at the parties responsible. We are the most powerful country in the world, and our government has a wide variety of tools at its disposal, including economic sanctions, law enforcement, and multilateral diplomacy. And building a multifaceted strategy to deter foreign hacking is going to require that all of those kinds of tools that I have mentioned by way of articulating responsible steps to deal with cybersecurity, steps that protect both our security and liberty, all of those tools are ones you would have to draw on. Now, having laid out ways, in my view, Mr. President, that the Senate on a bipartisan basis can improve cybersecurity, I want to turn to the proposal in detail that is now in front of the Senate. As I've said, I believe it makes sense to encourage private companies to share information about cybersecurity threats. So, cyber is a problem. The question of sharing information can be useful, but it is also vital that information sharing not be bereft of privacy protections for law-abiding Americans. Cybersecurity a problem, information sharing a plus, but let's make no mistake about it. An information sharing bill that lacks privacy protections really isn't a cybersecurity bill. It's a surveillance bill. And that's what has been one of my major concerns about this legislation. That the legislation in front of the Senate talked about the flaws in the process, but substantively, if you have an information sharing bill that lacks adequate privacy protections, it is a surveillance bill by another name. When the Senate Intelligence Committee voted on the CISA bill, I opposed it. And I opposed it because I believe its insufficient privacy protections will lead to large volumes of Americans' personal information from law-abiding Americans who have done nothing wrong, that they will be faced with the prospect that their information is shared with the government even when that information is not needed for cybersecurity. When I say personal information, I'm talking about the contents of emails, financial information, and what amounts to any data at all that is stored electronically. Now, my colleagues, some of them, have stressed that companies will have a choice about whether or not to participate in this kind of information sharing part of the legislation. That's true. But while corporations will have a choice about whether or not to participate, they will be able to do so without the knowledge or consent of their customers, and they will receive broad liability protections when they do so. The CISA bill, as written, trumps all federal privacy laws. Furthermore, once this information is shared with the government agencies would be permitted to use it for a wide variety of purposes unrelated to cybersecurity. And the bill creates what I consider to be a double standard, really a bizarre double standard, in that private information that is shared about individuals can be used for a variety of non-cybersecurity purposes, including law enforcement action against these individuals. But information about the companies supplying that information generally may not be used to police those companies. I will tell you, I think that's pretty hard to explain at a town hall meeting in virtually any corner of America, because I believe it's wrong to say that the privacy rights of corporations matter more than the privacy rights of individual Americans. Now, I expect that some colleagues will say it's not their intent to authorize this excessively broad collection. And the argument will be that this is just legislation to encourage companies to share information about actual cybersecurity threats, such as lines of malicious code and signatures of hostile cyber actors. Again, I would say to colleagues that I am all for encouraging companies to share information about genuine security threats. But if you read the language that is now before the Senate in the cybersecurity bill, the language of that bill is much more broad than just sharing information about genuine security threats. If senators want to pass a bill that's focused on real cybersecurity threats and include real protection for Americans' privacy, then the Senate should add language specifying that companies should only provide the government with individuals' personal information if it's necessary to describe a cybersecurity threat. That does not seem to me, Mr. President, to be an unreasonable protection for the privacy of Americans, that the Senate would adopt language specifying that the companies provide the government with individuals' personal information if it's necessary to describe a cyber threat. That's pretty obvious. We can explain that, I would say, to the distinguished President of the Senate at a town hall meeting, that if it's related to a cybersecurity threat, then the government would provide individuals' personal information. But this would discourage companies from unnecessarily sharing large amounts of their customers' private information with the government. Unfortunately, the cybersecurity bill in front of the Senate now takes the opposite approach. It only requires companies to withhold information that is known at the time of sharing to be personal information unrelated to cybersecurity. This information will clearly discourage companies from closely reviewing the information that they share and will lead to a much greater amount of Americans' personal information being transferred needlessly to government agencies. So I hope that here in the Senate, there'll be an opportunity to carefully consider the potential consequences of this legislation before voting to rush it through by an expedited process. I've said here several times, cybersecurity is a real problem, and policymakers are going to have to deal with it. And in fact, I'll go so far as to say, Mr. President, that the issue of cybersecurity is going to be an ongoing and enduring challenge of the digital age. It's my view that every senator who serves today in this body can expect to deal with cybersecurity questions for the rest of their career in public service. Voting to rush a bill through, however, is not going to make this problem somehow go away, and it will have real consequences for our constituents for years to come, and in particular, Mr. President, will not make us safer and will jeopardize the rights of individual Americans. Now, before I wrap up, Mr. President, I believe it's important, and I have an obligation, to draw my colleagues' attention to one final issue. As of this afternoon, there is a secret Justice Department legal opinion that is of clear relevance to this debate that continues to be withheld from the public. This opinion remains classified, so Senate rules prohibit me from describing it in detail. But I can say that it interprets common commercial service agreements and that, in my judgment, it is inconsistent with the public's understanding of the law. So this gets back, Mr. President, to a question I've talked about here on the floor often, which is secret law. When the public reads one thing and there's a secret interpretation that goes in another direction, and it contributes to the public's cynicism about Washington. Now, as always, I certainly see it as my job to say colleagues can decide whether or not to take my counsel, but I believe that any senator who votes for this legislation without reading this secret Justice Department legal opinion that I've referred to is voting without a full understanding of the relevant legal landscape. If senators do not understand how these common commercial service agreements have been interpreted by the executive branch, then it will be harder for the Senate to have a fully informed debate on the cybersecurity legislation, whether it's considered now or later. I'd also like to note for the record that I have repeatedly asked the Justice Department to withdraw this opinion and to make it public so that anyone who is party to one of these commercial service agreements can decide whether their agreement ought to be revised. The Justice Department has chosen to do neither of these things I've suggested. In public testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee, the deputy head of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel told me that she personally wouldn't rely on this opinion today, and I appreciate her views on that matter. Yet until the opinion is withdrawn, I believe that senators should be concerned about other government officials choosing to rely on it at any time. In my judgment, that is a very clear instance of the government developing what is essentially secret law that is at variance with what you read if you're in a coffee shop in Arkansas or Utah or anywhere else. And the reality is, as I've said often on the floor, Mr. President, operations always have to be secret. Sources and methods. Chairman Hatch remembers this from his service on the Intelligence Committee. Operations always have to be secret. But the law ought to be public, because that's how the American people have confidence in how we make decisions in our republic. And I'll close, Mr. President, by saying that it's quite obvious at this point that I have significant reservations about the cybersecurity bill. I believe that a number of senators are going to share these concerns. I'll let them speak for themselves, although I believe Senator Leahy's strong statement yesterday was certainly on point. Yet I would also say, even to the colleagues here who are inclined to vote for this bill, I hope all senators will think about whether this is an appropriate process for this sort of legislation. I've already said I believe that senators here are going to be dealing with cybersecurity questions for the rest of their time in public service. Because in the digital age, I think we are going to see a constant evolution in this field with respect to these threats and both the technical and political concerns that are raised by that. So should the Senate really be rushing a bill like this through by tacking it on to an unrelated defense measure? Is this the best way to show once again to the American people that security and liberty are not mutually exclusive, that it's possible to do both? If senators share the concerns I've raised, I hope that they will oppose the cybersecurity amendment if it is brought up for a vote on the defense bill. I hope that senators here will support this issue being brought to the floor under a different process, a process that involves regular order, so that every senator here on both sides of the aisle would have an opportunity to make the revisions that I believe it needs and offer their own ideas. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.